This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're exploring efforts to help New Yorkers with disabilities live as independently as possible. And our guests are Tyler Whitney, President and CEO of Southern Adirondack Independent Living. Thanks for joining us, Tyler.
Thank you for having me.
And we're also hearing from Lindsay Miller, Executive Director of the New York Association on Independent Living, which represents the centers all over the state. Welcome back to the show, Lindsay.
Thank you for having me.
Well, for starters, the wish list for this year's budget includes funding for independent living center operations, including your organizations, putting them into the state-funded cost of living adjustment that you are traditionally excluded from, as well as a reversal of a cut to an initiative designed to make homes more accessible for low-income people with disabilities so they can stay in their homes. We can get into the significance of these topics and the specific asks you have for policymakers in a second. But first, it feels to me, based on the interviews that I seem to be doing year after year, like you're fighting the same battles year after year. I mean, does this feel like Groundhog Day to you, or do you feel like you've taken steps backwards in this effort to lobby Albany? You feel like you've made progress? How do you feel about the position you're in heading into this latest budget fight?
Yeah, that's a good question, David. And it does feel a bit like Groundhog Day. Unfortunately, it starts to feel like we're spinning our wheels a bit when we're continually coming both to the legislature in response to the executive budget in not only asking for investments in common sense, very modestly funded programs, but also having to ask for restoration of funding that is proposed to be cut in the executive budget. So it can be very frustrating. Particularly, I think this year there was a lot of fear about what the budget was going to look like because of all of the cuts at the federal level. And while we were fortunate that that didn't come to fruition, unfortunately, in our instance, like as I mentioned, we're fighting back these kind of cuts to these very low funded programs as it is, and not instead helping to promote and work alongside the governor and the legislature to support investments in these very essential programs for people with disabilities.
Yeah, I completely agree, Lindsay. As an ILC, we are seeing that we get one win and then we take two steps back. And we have to go back and continue to fight for that funding, which doesn't allow us to really advance our mission. We see the needs growing, but we see the funding, getting pushed back and having to restore that little sliver of extra funding that we do receive to keep our operations alive and going.
And Lindsay used the framing of this as an investment. And I have to be honest with you, I do a lot of interviews where everybody's pet project is described as an investment. And often, though, they're just talking about, say, their operating budget. But for something like the Access to Home program, this really is an investment in keeping people in their homes and potentially avoiding costs down the road by the having to put them into, say, like an institutional setting. So can you talk
Absolutely.
about the cut that you're looking at there and what you would like to see funded for this important home modification program?
Yeah, absolutely. The Access to Home program, which is funded under Homes and Community Renewal, is a program that provides for very modest home modifications to make a home more accessible. So, for individuals who might acquire a disability or just getting older and have age-related disabilities, or even individuals who end up institutionalized and are looking to return to their home, the difference from them being able to do that or to age in place might be as simple as grab bars in their bathroom
Mhm.
or ramp to the front door. And so this program allows for those very modest and simple home modifications so that individuals can stay in their own home. Unfortunately, the program has historically been underfunded. We've been very fortunate in the last couple of years to have strong legislative support. So the program has increased from $1 million funding up until in last year's budget, $5 million. Unfortunately, in this year's executive budget, that proposes bringing it back down to $1 million. And when you're thinking about statewide, how many projects is $1 million really going to, provide when you do the math in terms of how much can be used for, it would fund 40 projects, and it certainly wouldn't be eligible in all 62 counties across the state.
And I think that investment term is really important. We can look at this as a cost savings measure for the state, keeping people living in their homes with, like Lindsay said, modest investments like grab bars or ramps, or really simple things in homes to help people live independently, as opposed to institutional placement, can go a long way. I think that we see this double fold in the rural regions up here, where it's a lot more difficult to get to facilities. And if you're looking at a placement, you're looking at a placement that's far away from the place that your family lives, your home that you grew up in, that you raised your family in. And if we have the ability to make that modest investment in someone's home, why wouldn't we?
And what about state support for your operations? It's my understanding that you're looking at a cut of about $750,000 that would bring the support to the independent living centers down to 16 million. At the same time, you're looking for an increase in that base funding up to $25 million. What does the governor's level of funding mean for your capacity moving forward? And what do you think you could do with $25 million distributed across the state?
Yeah, I think that, for us, like we said in the beginning, having to go back and fight for the $750,000 legislative ad really diminishes our ability to fight for the 25 million that would really make it so that we could do what we need to do for our communities across all 62 counties. Losing that 750,000 across 41 centers, again, it's a very small amount of money per center, but it does allow us to do a better reach, a better ability to serve again, in the rural areas, these rural communities that are, kind of placed up, you look at Hamilton County, there's few people and few towns up there. So, when we have extra money, we are able to reach those individuals and keep them living independently. With 25 million across the centers, that really allows us to, I think, reach the need that is there. We have aging populations. We have more and more individuals with disabilities needing services, needing support to live in the community. And with our current level of funding, we are just barely getting by. And some centers, I think, really struggle to meet those needs. And we could do a lot more to help people live independently and ultimately save the state money with that investment.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce both of you for listeners just joining us. This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Tyler Whitney, President and CEO of Southern Adirondack Independent Living, and Lindsay Miller, Executive Director of the New York Association on Independent Living. So, are you guys banking on the ability of the legislature in the process of budget negotiations to restore that $750,000 to the centers to ultimately increase the support for access to home? Or is there reason to believe that this choreography that we typically see in Albany is going to play out in a different way, that there is a chance that the legislature might not go to bat for you with the same fervor, or maybe the governor draws a hard line in the sand and you guys are dealing with a new dynamic moving forward?
I think we've been very fortunate to have very strong legislative support in both the education committees and housing for these two programs. So we're hopeful and feel strongly that the legislature will, at a minimum, help restore the proposed cuts in the executive budget. At the end of the day, I think whether we can see additional investment always comes down to what the other priorities are across the three houses and where things land. So that's where we have a little bit of uncertainty at this point.
And what about new ways of spending, say, Medicaid dollars? We hear a lot about the idea of flexibility and the state pursuing waivers. Are the independent living centers part of that conversation? And is that something that you're looking to be part of in this budget process as a new way of creatively spending Medicaid dollars?
Yeah, I think we're very interested in being part of that conversation and particularly with the Department of Health. We've seen in recent years two of the programs that the independent living community really helped to create and establish in New York State to support people with disabilities, and that's the Consumer Directed Personal Assistance Program and the Nursing Home Transition and Diversion Medicaid Waiver. Both of those programs saw exponential growth. And as a result, the state kind of cracked down and in the instance of CDPAP, completely redesigned the structure of the program. And with the nursing home transition diversion waiver, just merely shut down the front door, rather than acknowledging there's a growing need in the state and that we need to come up with creative solutions to make sure the programs stay viable and that the services are available for the people that need them. So we're very eager to be engaged in some conversations on creative solutions and how we can make sure these programs that we know work are still available to the people that need them, and how we can, make changes to address the growing need and the growing expenses as a result of that need.
I completely agree with that, Lindsay. As a regional resource development center for the NHCD program, we're seeing what I would consider nonsensical changes to the program without actually talking to the RRDCs and providers and participants on ways that we could look at flexible spending and revamping of programs rather than shutting the front door. As the state is about to release an Olmstead plan, we're closing front doors for individuals with disabilities and older adults to receive services at home. If the goal here for Department of Health is to save money, they really should be speaking with the regional resource development centers, providers, ILCs alike to gain valuable insight on how we actually operate these programs.
Well, lastly, the governor has since scrapped a push that she had in her original budget to expand the autonomous vehicle deployment for hired capacity, essentially robot Ubers, we'll call them. And you wanted to see that done in a specific manner with certain accessibility provisions in mind. Obviously, it's off the table this year's budget, but what sort of guarantees were you looking for in this area if it was something that was part of the budget?
Yeah, we wanted to make sure if there's any new modes of transportation being introduced in the state that we ensure accessibility for people with disabilities. What we saw happen with TNC's transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft is that there was no requirement for accessible vehicles. So ultimately, what happened is, those ride sharing companies have kind of taken over private transportation across the state at the expense of taxi companies that at least had accessible vehicles. So we've seen really access to transportation for people with disabilities get more difficult as we're seeing these new transportation companies enter into the infrastructure.
I think we could build on that in rural communities that we don't even have accessible transportation or transportation in general for individuals. So when we're talking about accessible transportation in more urban settings, I think it lends itself a conversation about how difficult it is for someone who utilizes a wheelchair or assistive device to actually access transportation in rural counties as well.
Well, if the program had been rolled out with the appropriate safeguards, do you think the governor's now scrapped plan of for hire autonomous vehicles outside of New York City could have been an important asset for New Yorkers with disabilities, letting them live more independently, get around more independently? Or do you take more of a skeptical wait and see, trust but verify sort of approach with anything like that, given the experience with, say, Uber and Lyft and the lack of accessibility there?
Yeah, I think we were cautiously optimistic. We've seen in other states that there was a commitment for accessibility, and then that kind of got scaled back, and the access wasn't really there. So we were pushing that if it was going to move forward, there had to be fully accessible vehicles available, but we were not optimistic that that would come to fruition.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this conversation. We've been speaking with Lindsay Miller. She's the executive director of the New York Association on Independent Living. Thanks as always, Lindsay.
Thank you for having us.
And we've also heard from Tyler Whitney, president and CEO of Southern Adirondack Independent Living. Thank you, Tyler.
Thank you.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell and Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.